Welcome again to the Explaining History podcast, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Professor Angie Hobbs of Sheffield University, whose new book, Why Plato Matters Now, is a kind of a meeting of Plato's philosophy and the contemporary dilemmas that we face and the issues we navigate in the 21st century. It's been a real honour to have Angie today. So, firstly, well, before we dive into talk about the book, welcome and welcome to the Explaining History.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me on. I'm really looking forward to this.
Fabulous, fabulous. So, we're going to start from the standpoint of, I mean, I'm a modern historian, and my knowledge of classical philosophy is very, very slender, a kind of like a pub quiz level. So let's start from the standpoint of looking at Plato for those that know very little about him, when he lived, and the kinds of ideas that were associated with him. Perhaps you can just give us a primer on Plato to begin with.
Sure. Yeah, he was born probably 428, 427 BCE, possibly a few years later. He was born into Athens, into an aristocratic family at a really turbulent time. So during his youth, Athens was engaged in a really bitter civil war with Sparta and their respective allies. So that was all going on. But also within Athens itself, there was a ferocious feud between the oligarchs and the democrats,
Right.
supporters of different kinds of political regime. And that division was played out within Plato's own family. So he grew up with absolute sort of chaos around him. And it's no surprise that when he reaches adulthood, he, in his political theory, his chief goal is social harmony. And if you
Right.
look at his youth, we can understand that. His father and indeed his stepfather died while he was pretty young. And his chief mentor and friend as he was growing up was the Socrates, the very, very famous sort of instigator of ethical philosophy in the West, who refused to write anything down but tramped around Athens, engaging people in dialogue and debate. And when Plato sort of starts to write, he adopts a written dialogue form, and that's partly to emulate his mentor. He's always trying to stimulate us to ask questions, to invite us into the dialogue. His own life was actually really dramatic. He wanted a quiet life. He wanted to just sort of sit and write in a library, but that did not happen for him.
No.
So when he was in his probably about 27, 28, his beloved Socrates was put to death
Mhm.
by the Athenian democracy on trumped up charges of corrupting the young and refusing to believe in the city's gods and introducing new gods, all politically motivated. And in utter grief and disgust, Plato disappears for about 10 years, pretty much. He probably has to do some military service from time to time, but he travels for 10 years around the Greek world, to all around Greece, to Sicily, to southern Italy, so-called Magna Graecia, almost certainly to Egypt and Cyrene in modern Libya. He studies with the Pythagorean philosophers and mathematicians and hippies in southern Italy. So he has a pretty dramatic time. He comes back.
Right.
He sets in about 387. He comes back to Athens and he does not go into politics. He was expected to go into politics because he was an aristocrat. That was what he was educated for. But he'd been too disgusted by both the oligarchic tyrannies he'd seen and the failures of democracy. So he sets up his own research and teaching institute called the Academy, just outside the city's walls, and he teaches there and writes there pretty much for the rest of his life. He has two more trips back to Sicily to try to train up the young tyrant Dionysius II to be a philosopher ruler. Hopeless failure. He only just escapes with his life. So, he has three trips to Sicily. They're all dramatic. His life is in danger many times. But back in Athens, he's training up future, not just future philosophers, but future rulers and advisors and legislators. And he becomes hugely influential And his dialogues just really tackle all the big questions of philosophy. What really exists? How do we know that it exists? How do we know that we know anything? Ethics, questions of ethics, political theory, aesthetics, psychology, just everything. And yes, and people will know about probably his most famous work, The Republic,
Mm-hmm.
in which the supposedly ideally just state is described by the character of Socrates. All the dialogues contain debates between different characters. Plato never writes in his own voice. We never know exactly what he thinks. And he's very ironic, he's very playful, he's mischievous. And one thing to bear in mind is that this ideally just state that we call the Republic, written about in the
Mm.
dialogue called the Republic, which is very authoritarian, indeed totalitarian, and I'm certainly wouldn't want to live in it. However, the book we know as the Republic, we call the Republic, would be banned in the ideally just state it describes because it doesn't meet the censorship criteria. So
Right.
we can never quite know for sure what Plato thinks. We have to think for ourselves.
So it's really interesting. I mean, I think we'll come on in a moment to looking at the intersection between Plato and the modern world, where we are and how his ideas address some of the things we see. But in this idea of social harmony, I think, from the sort of the late 20th into the 21st century, successively, every kind of great model for social harmony that we've presented ourselves with, these are the various kind of capitalist and socialist utopias, have fallen one by one. We're in, I think, perhaps one of the crises, one of the kind of the omni crises we're in at the moment is that everything we've tried to create, and most of the architects of the horrors we see in the 20th and 21st centuries, if you go way back, there's some fairly well-intended people thinking, what if we can make this sort of fabulous world? There are, I think, at the moment, various well-intended people in Silicon Valley coming up with all sorts of wonderful ideas, which in a decade or two will be kind of wincing over. But what do you think? I mean, what do you think Plato would make of the kind of the death of these big narratives that we've kind of constructed for ourselves?
That's such an interesting question. Well, I think he would want to distinguish the general goal of trying to achieve harmony within a state and between different classes, and friendship in a state, from the really big utopian projects that you're talking about, which often, as you say, very quickly degenerate into dystopia. So not every attempt at social harmony has to be totalitarian.
Right.
He is very keen on people thinking for themselves and taking moral responsibility and moral agency. So he would certainly say that social harmony can't be imposed from the outside. You can't force people to be friendly. It has to be organic. It has to grow from within, and you have to look at policies in your education and your arts and so on where that's possible. He does give us one really interesting idea to think about, and I mean it's like many of the ideas put forward, particularly in the Republic. It's you could say it's way too extreme, but it's certainly interesting. So in the Republic, in the ideally just state that Socrates describes, there is complete divorce between power and wealth, total divorce. So the guardian class, which is divided into two, the philosopher rulers and their military and executive assistants, the auxiliaries, who together are called the guardians, they are not allowed to own any property at all or any money. They're not even allowed to touch gold or silver. They might be allowed to own a comb or a sponge or something very personal like that, but absolutely no wealth whatsoever. They have all the power, but none of the wealth. Now, the third class is the producer class, and they are allowed private homes and to make money, though even there are limits are placed on both wealth and poverty.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the guardian class live in camp communes, and all their physical material needs are provided by the producers. Now, that's a pretty good incentive. If you're in power, it's a pretty good incentive to treat those you rule well.
Yeah,
If you are going to starve if you don't treat them well. I mean,
yeah,
that's no, okay, that's too extreme. But think of all the debates we're having at the moment about money in politics.
yeah,
How many jobs can one politician have? How much money can they earn outside their political
yeah,
representative role? How much money can go into the funding of political parties? Think of all those debates.
yeah.
And Plato would certainly look at all that and say, look, money is absolutely poisoning your politics. It's creating divisions, and you're getting rulers and would-be rulers who are seeking to rule not through creating harmony, but explicitly, specifically by creating fear, intolerance, suspicion, division, hatred, and fomenting civil discord. He would certainly look at that and say, my goodness, you've got this wrong.
And he would be right. He would be right. I mean, we're at this moment in, if you think of the politics of Great Britain just alone, but this moment where things have been perhaps not as corrupted as they were since the 1832 Reform Act. It's that kind of rotten borough level of in some cases just absolute naked corruption. And when you allow kind of huge concentrations of wealth, and you allow, when you have stupendously wealthy people that can buy virtually anything they want, what they tend to want to buy eventually is political power.
Mm.
And so that was true in Plato's time, and it's true in ours. These things don't become.
It is, and what we're dealing with is politicians not just trying to make a bit of or a lot of money on the side, but actually trying to make money out of their political jobs
Yeah,
and completely forgetting that they are elected to serve,
yeah.
not to act as sort of little despots. And that kind of grifting is extraordinary, and we're seeing it all around the world at the moment, and it's certainly as bad as it has been in my lifetime.
I think I noticed when I was looking at the book, there was a bit about what Plato might have to say about things like celebrity, the culture of celebrity and fame.
Mm.
And we think of this idea of celebrity as being a particularly modern thing, perhaps dating back to the first moving pictures or music hall or what have you. But obviously, there's kind of been an aspect of it um, in some guise throughout human history. And where did it feature in Plato's time?
Oh, yes, such a rich seam of Plato's thought. So, as far as I'm aware, no philosopher has ever interrogated notions such as the hero, heroism, honor, honoring, or indeed fame as deeply and as over such a long period as Plato.
Mm-hmm.
And he thinks the term hero does have value and potency, and that for various reasons we occasionally need heroes. We need to try and look for the hero within ourselves and so on. So he doesn't want to get rid of the term hero, but he really does not want it to be devalued and corrupted so it morphs into celebrity. The
Yes.
question is, has the celebrity actually does some have they actually done something worth celebrating? Now, this links to Plato's view of human psychology. And in the middle period of his writings, he divides the human psyche into three kind of basic faculties, three motivational sets, if you like. He says we have a reasoning faculty, which desires truth and reality. And we have an appetitive faculty, which desires physical satisfaction and the material wealth that might be needed to achieve that. But, and this is really interesting, and Freud picks up on this. He says there's a third faculty. He calls it the thumoides, but I mean, it's a spirited faculty. It desires honor, success, reputation, respect. Now, at its best, says Plato, that can be harnessed to support the rule of reason and it can be really a really important sort of source of energy in us. It can motivate us to be our best selves, to it can enlarge our moral ambition.
Mhm.
But if it is corrupted and it seeks success and in the wrong places, such as in the acquisition and consumption of wealth, or just power over others, or doing whatever you feel like doing in the wrong places, then it can help us be our worst selves.
Yes.
So this is a really important faculty. What do you honor? What do you respect? What do you yearn for? And Plato takes the sort of traditional version of the hero, which would be Homeric, the sort of the heroes of Homer's Odyssey and Iliad, Achilles and Odysseus. And he says, okay, they're pretty tarnished. They've got pretty poor morals in lots of ways. Plato tries to enlarge the notion of the hero to include figures like his beloved Socrates, who was brave, who did fight on military campaigns. He wasn't a wimp at all. But his chief thing was to fight for truth and justice. And Plato says you don't have to be on a battlefield to be a hero. You can be a hero by risking or even giving your life to support truth and justice. So he does a lot, both to enlarge the notion of the hero and, as you say, to distinguish it from mere celebrity.
Yeah.
Some heroes may be worth celebrating. All heroes should be worth celebrating. But not all celebrities are heroes by any means.
No.
So, and I think this is a really important thing. And Freud picks up on this. And in Freud's analysis of our ego, superego, and the id, Freud says, well, I'm not sure if he says it explicitly, but there are a lot of links between the superego and Plato's spirited element of the faculty. And we know Freud read Plato, loved Plato, translated bits of Plato. So yeah, really important.
Is it a
And
Jungian?
sorry. And I just was going to say, and I think Plato's exploration of all this can really help us. We've got all these debates, haven't we, at the moment about who should we erect statues for? What statues should be created? What should fall? What should be removed to museums? Who do we want to honor? Who should we give medals for? We're having huge debates at the moment. I think there's an enormous debate in the US at the moment
Yes.
about Confederate, leaders of the Confederate Army and whether there should be statues to them and so on. So, and we've had similar debates in the UK and in many other countries. So, and Plato's going to say you can find out so much about a culture and about a person by finding out who their heroes are, who do they honor, and should they be honoring that person.
And I was just going to say there's a kind of you mentioned sort of Freud there, and there are kind of echoes of kind of Jungian ideas there too. The idea of we can go either one of two ways. We can be the benign ruler or the shadow self. That's kind of written within a lot of his writing. I would imagine that Jung probably read a bit of Plato as well. But
Thank you. I mean, I don't know enough about Jung, but you're not the first person to say, oh, there are links between Plato and Jung. So I need to go and follow up on that, and I will do more reading because as I said, I'm hearing this quite a bit, and I think that's intriguing. I mean, it will be amazing if Plato, 2000 sort of 400 years before clinical psychology, just through pure observation and thought and reflection,
yeah,
actually comes up with some very sort of deep analyses of human motivation.
well, I mean, psychoanalysis begins as a kind of not an offshoot of medicine essentially at the time, and it comes really from people like Freud feeling their way to begin with, um, and figuring it out through observation.
And Plato, I think, as far as I know, in the Republic, he's your listeners can correct me if I'm wrong. I think he's the first person in the West to use the model of mental health.
Right.
So in the Republic, he says that if you have internal harmony between these three parts of your psyche, that internal psychic harmony constitutes both your flourishing, your eudaimonia in the Greek, which is not just happiness, it's more to do with the fulfillment of your potential, the actualization of your faculties. And so he says this internal psychic harmony, it's both your flourishing and it's also your internal justice. It's in your internal virtue. And he says that this is a kind of mental health. And that's the first time I think we see that phrase. And he says, why would you not want mental health? Given how much we want physical health, why would you want your mind to be unhealthy? So really, really interesting in this whole notion of what it is to flourish and how you need to exercise certain virtues, such as courage, in order to flourish, both as an individual and a community.
Yes.
Again, we're seeing that at the moment, aren't we? Right now, if democracy is going to survive across the world, it's going to take courage, certainly moral courage, and I hope not, but I fear actual physical courage.
Yeah.
In fact, in Ukraine, we're seeing it's taking absolute physical courage. So these things have to be fought for.
And on that subject, I mean, you were saying to begin with that Plato had lived through this period of immense conflict, and we are living in an age of immense conflict. The reason why in countries like Great Britain it doesn't feel like we are in an age of immense conflict is we're not in the kind of the conditions of the Second World War. But if you look at Eritrea, at Gaza, if you look at Ukraine, if you look at parts of sub-Saharan Africa, the South China Sea, if you live in any of those places, you would be forgiven for thinking you were in World War III, and maybe you are in those if you live in those places. What would be Plato's answers for the time in which we live now? What were his answers when it came to conflict?
Comcast is committed to bringing access to the internet to all Americans, including rural communities across the country, like Sussex County, Delaware.
We were being left behind. Everybody around us seemed to have internet, but we did not. High-speed internet is one of those good things that we needed to help us move our farming, our small businesses, our recreation forward.
Learn more about how we're bringing our next-generation network to more people across the country at ComcastCorporation.com/investment in America.
Yes, thank you. I've thought about this a lot, and Plato thought about it a lot. And one of the most incisive and penetrating parts of all his writing comes in books 8 and 9 of the Republic, when he gives us an absolutely coruscating analysis of how a democracy can be subverted to tyranny by a cynical and opportunistic demagogue. Now, he had no experience of representative democracy. Direct democracy was the only kind he knew, and he wasn't a huge fan of it, but he did think it was a heck of a lot better than tyranny, and he had experienced tyranny at the court of Dionysius the first in Syracuse in Sicily, and then at the court of his son Dionysius II. And as we've seen, Plato on both occasions, on all his trips to Sicily, he only just escaped with his life because he kept criticizing tyranny. And here's what he says. So he says and I think we would really do well to listen to this warning. So he says that democracies have a lot of charm, they're fun, they're colorful, they're vibrant, they're very attractive places to live, but they're very vulnerable to attacks from without and also from within through complacency, through inattention, through moral confusion and indifference, and particularly the corruption of language. He says that the corruption of morals starts with the corruption of language and the subversion of moral terms, and people people start calling shamelessness courage, and they confuse liberty with license, and particularly they abuse words like freedom and democracy. And they hijack those terms for their own tyrannical ends. So here's how he says it happens. He says the demagogue gets voted into power by democratic means. They abuse the democratic process, they get voted into power. They build up a cult following around themselves in which they can do no wrong. They start to abuse the rule of law and bring baseless legal charges against their opponents. They identify themselves with the people. I mean, where have we heard this from in the 20th century? The tyrant saying, or the would-be tyrant saying, I am the people, I am, the country. And they say that anybody who criticizes them or opposes them is a hater of the people and is exiled or imprisoned or killed. That, of course, creates genuine enemies. Why wouldn't it? So they then start to build up their own personal bodyguard, and then they create a private army.
Yeah.
So we've now got a situation where the rule of law is gone. The military has been sort of neutralized, and the person on the way to becoming a tyrant, the demagogue, has got their own private army. They then keep stirring up external conflicts and fights. They need external wars because that will keep the people fearful and feeling in need of a strong leader. And here's a point which is often forgotten, I think, and we really would do well to remember it. That Plato says, because this demagogue got into power through the support of the poor and the less educated, they need to keep people poor and undereducated to stay in power.
Yeah,
they do. So they want their supporters to be fearful, and they also want their supporters to stay poor. And so naturally, the people who voted the demagogue in start to protest. They start to rebel. They say, this isn't why we voted you in. This isn't what we want. And then, says Plato, and again, we need to pay heed to this. He says, the demagogue then turns on his own supporters. And Plato says the full-blooded tyrant is born when the demagogue starts to turn on his own people and use his private army against his own people. My goodness, we need to watch that. It's happening in various countries in the world right now. And Plato doesn't mince his words. He says the man becomes a wolf. Yeah. So, he's really explicit. How does all this start? It starts through inattention, through laziness, through complacency, through just not noticing what's going on and not noticing, and you'll become vulnerable to being manipulated.
Yeah.
And it particularly starts, as Plato, through inattention to language, through people misusing language and you not calling it out. When people start to misuse words like freedom, you have to call it out every time. And again, so this, and you have to take moral responsibility, and you have to work for these values, and you have to, hopefully not with arms, but fight for these values.
And our system for holding language to account, or political language to account, in much of the Western world has become utterly corrupted. So, I mean, that really is supposed to be our various media systems.
Oh my goodness!
Their own but this is it. When you have someone like Trump, and he's not the first. I was just reading a book about the 9/11 era last night, and listening to and reading, just reminding myself about Bush and Rumsfeld's kind of freedomisms, whilst flying people around the world and torturing them. And it's like, well, freedom for whom? Freedom for what? And it's really freedom for the power of accumulated wealth to do as it will. And I mean, I think a great cause of democratic decline and democratic crisis are the systems that are meant to hold language to account in that Platonic term. Have fallen in many places. So Trump can say what he wants, and you have, instead of a critical filter, you simply have stenographers just repeating it and amplifying it.
Exactly. And I've been trying to think about what would Plato make of social media. I mean, he would certainly want social media to be subjected to editorial controls and be treated as a publishing platform, that seems a very long way off. So Plato would then say, okay, then you have to go at the other end and you have to educate people. You have to give people the resources in how to conduct constructive, collaborative dialogue, including with people with whom we may disagree really quite profoundly on political or religious issues. But he also models in his dialogues not just good, constructive, collaborative dialogue. He also models bad dialogue. He has some bad apples, some bad players come on deliberately, and he wants to reveal the kinds of, in some cases, bullying and bludgeoning that they use, in other cases, verbal tricks and skullduggery and fallacious arguments. He's trying to expose all that. He's trying to give his readers the resources to spot what's going on and to call it out, and to sort of train us all in both how to do good dialogue, but also how to spot bad dialogue. Whether we're, the attempts to deceive us and manipulate us are from a politician or a self-styled religious or cultural leader or a social media influencer. I mean, goodness, one can have fun thinking what Plato would think about the term social media influencer. And he's trying to give us the tools to take responsibility and to be agents, because democracy, as we all know, means rule by the people. Demagoguery means a leading of the people. So we need to remain active and not become passive dupes.
Yeah.
And I think this training in language and how to think and how to speak with ourselves, but also with each other, that's one of the many reasons he writes in the dialogue form. And there's a really important distinction he makes. We've talked quite a bit about the abuse of the word freedom that we see going on all around the world at the moment. And and freedom of speech, what is freedom of speech and freedom of expression? And I could, Vance claimed that people in Europe don't have freedom of expression anymore, but all sorts of journalists are being banned from the White House. However, Plato says, look, there's at least two kinds of freedom. There's the freedom to do whatever you feel like, whatever you happen to want, and he uses one set of Greek terms for that. But then he says real freedom is when you are in control of yourself, when your reason is in control of your whims and your momentary appetites. So, and if you don't have that second kind of freedom, of moral agency and responsibility and intellectual authority, then you're going to be vulnerable to lose the first kind of freedom, and somebody else is going to take that away. So I think, I don't want the ideally just state that he describes in the Republic to exist. I don't believe in the ideal forms of beauty and goodness and justice that he talks about, but I still think there is so much that we can learn from Plato, and that he really does matter right now, which is sort of good for the title of my book, but in a sense it's sad. In a sense it's a shame he matters so much right now, because the world is in such a mess.
We must finish in just a moment, and this is it's almost like Plato's warning from history. But let's just talk about the book very quickly. Available currently in all good bookshops?
On the 28th of August, being published on the 28th of August in the UK, and I think Europe. Now in the US, I think it comes out on the 28th of October.
Okay.
But it can be pre-ordered. And yes, indeed, I can. It's and there's an audiobook as well, which I narrated. I also narrated the audiobook, and I already had a lot of respect for people who narrate audiobooks, and my goodness, that respect has gone up. It's a really hard thing to do.
So I'll put links below. As we say on the podcast every time, please, if you can, buy it from a local bookshop if you can. If you can't, please buy it directly from the publisher. And avoid giving your money to gigantic retail platforms, because they will just simply wipe everything else out. Angie, it was a pleasure. It was an education, and it was a delight to talk today. Let's finish there, and thank you so much for joining us. It was
Thank you for inviting me. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
fabulous.
Thank you so much.
It'll be wonderful to chat again. It really would.
Thank you.
Yes.
You'll get more than you expect with McValue at McDonald's. Like deals on your late night go-tos when the party goes till dawn. And savings on their faves. So date night always passes the vibe check. Plus, when the fam shows up for the weekend, you can show out for breakfast.
Buy one breakfast sandwich, add one for $1. Only in the app. Limited time only at participating McDonald's. Valid once a day. Must opt into rewards. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.